Hello and welcome to the Leadership Forum at Silver Bay podcast. For 101 years, business, organizational, community, educational, and citizen leaders have met on the shores of beautiful Lake George to address the most pressing human and leadership issues of their times. These leaders have come to the Leadership Forum to understand, shape, and deepen the skills required to lead in an increasingly complex and changing world. Economic, social, and political challenges around the globe continue to underscore one essential truth: leadership matters. If you'd like to learn more about the Leadership Forum, please go to www.leadershipforumatsilverbay.com. My name is Rob Salafia. I am the founder and CEO of Protagonist Consulting Group, as well as a lecturer at MIT Sloan School of Business and an MIT Leadership Center Master Executive Coach, and your host for the Leadership Forum at Silver Bay podcast. I'm joined today by Todd Churches. Todd is an adjunct professor of leadership at New York University and lecturer on leadership at Columbia University. Todd is a popular keynote speaker, panelist, and blogger. He's the CEO and co-founder of the leadership and executive coaching firm Big Blue Gumball, whose motto is, "We make training entertaining." He's also a soon-to-be author of the book Visual Leadership, Leveraging the Power of Visual Thinking in Leadership and in Life, being published by Simon & Schuster Post-Hill Press. Todd, the name of your book is called Visual Leadership. So paint us a picture. What is it about?
Thanks, Rob. As the saying goes, a picture is 1,000 words, so that's the foundation of what visual leadership is all about. So basically, it's about the art and science of applying visual thinking and visual communication tools, tips, and techniques to becoming a more effective thinker, communicator, manager, and leader.
I like that. Thinker, communicator, manager, and leader. I like all of those coming together. So tell us more.
Yeah, sure. Basically, the idea behind visual leadership, long story short, I started my career in advertising in New York for Ogilvy and Mather, and then I moved out to LA and I worked in the entertainment industry for a number of years in a variety of areas, including I worked in marketing for Michael Nesmith of the Monkees. You may remember him. All of us baby boomers grew up on his music.
Yes, I do. Very, very talented, by the way.
Quirky guy and a visual thinker. One of the things that people don't know is he was one of the founders and original creators of MTV. So he was basically, if you remember, like movies like The Beatles, Help, and Yellow Submarine, some of the things the Beatles were doing, the Monkees kind of replicated that, and Michael Nesmith basically took those concepts and started creating music videos to accompany music, and that started the foundation with Bob Pittman of MTV. So think about how MTV is basically the visual representation of music as it started out in its early days. So that's a great example I hadn't thought of before of visual thinking.
Fantastic. So,
so after working for Michael, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
How do you break it apart? Help us understand it.
Sure. Just getting back real fast. I worked for Michael Nesmith of the Monkees. I worked for Aaron Spelling, and then in Disney and CBS developing TV shows, and then I was a project manager in the theme park business. So everything I had done up until that point in my career before getting into management, leadership development, and executive coaching was formed based on the visual medium of television and entertainment and then theme parks. So if you combine all of these things together, visual leadership is really about using visual imagery, mental models, metaphors and analogies, and visual storytelling. That's how I break it down into those four components.
Fantastic. So the four components: visual imagery, mental models and frameworks, metaphors and analogies, visual storytelling. Now, being a storyteller myself, I use a lot of analogies and metaphors and teach this work as well. This is exciting stuff. It's very creative. And so for a lot of business people, they see this as somewhat daunting, or, does it really relate to business? I'd love to hear a little bit more, and I'm sure everyone would love to hear a little bit more about each one of these components and how we can simply use these.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we'll get into a few more few details and examples, but that's a great point. It's like when I did a workshop on visual leadership a couple of weeks ago, actually 3 in 3 days for groups of CEOs, and that was the reactions. Like, I'm not in the creative business. We do construction or we do insurance, whatever. How does this relate to me? We're not in the arts. We're not in design. And basically, I said, visual imagery. You're a leader of your organization. Do you have a vision of where you want your company to be a year from now? Yes. So right there, you're using visual imagery to think about an idealized state of the future that's better, different than, and better, different from and better than where you currently are, right? So that's visual imagery. Mental models. Picture your organization, picture the people, now visualize your organizational chart. Picture you're the CEO and picture each level down. Do you have that vision in your mind? Yes. You just used a mental model to visualize where your company is. Metaphors and analogies. What business are you in? Can you use the metaphor analogy to explain what you do and how you do it? Then they gave some examples of that. And visual storytelling, tell me about how you started your company. What did you do beforehand? Well, back in the day, I did this and this. You just used all 4 of them in under like 3 minutes. So that right there was like they were sold. They're like, I get it. Now how can I be better at this?
Fantastic. So now you just went really fast through those, and I got a couple of, and I'm sure we all got a couple of those pictures. Let's take it a little slower and walk people through visual imagery. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. Here's an example of visual imagery. Picture an iceberg in your mind. So when you see an iceberg, what comes to mind? You see, some people think the Titanic, right? So you could say, I picture my company hitting an iceberg. So what that represents metaphorically, what are some of the landmines, metaphor, that we have to avoid? But visual imagery, if you picture an iceberg, there's the piece of the iceberg, what we refer to as the tip of the iceberg, above the surface. But we all know that beneath the surface is this gigantic hunk of ice that's probably 20 times the size of what we see. So I may say, what does that represent? What are some examples of that in business? You may say, well, if I'm looking at the leading indicators of what's going on in the market, that's the tip of the iceberg. So the Dow Jones, today's Dow Jones readings are the tip of the iceberg, but what does that represent? We need to dive beneath the surface. You are interviewing job candidates, and you meet them and you say, I like this person or I don't like this person, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. You don't know what it's really like to work with this person, so that's why we use techniques like behavioral interviewing to dive beneath the surface and find out more. So the iceberg in and of itself is a visual image that we could keep in our mind that represents a concept that will help us make business decisions and find solutions.
And it also seems to me it's easy to, everyone gets it right away.
That's one of the things. Visual imagery is universal, and I do a lot of work. A lot of my students are international students, many from China. And visual images, I use a lot of them in my PowerPoint slides in my class because they cross language lines. People see it and they say, okay, I get it. And one of my mottos is, as you're thinking about how do I get an idea out of my head and into someone else's head, the idea ultimately is, your goal as a communicator is to get the other person to say something like, I see what you're saying. So even that phrase alone represents visually saying, you came up with an idea, you put it into words, I processed it, yes, I see what you're saying.
This brings up something. I had a coaching session earlier today, and I was helping this business leader with a presentation that he was making. And the amount of words on each slide was astounding.
Yeah.
And I always said to him, I said, 3-second rule. If your audience cannot get what's on that slide in 3 seconds, blow it up. And what you just said is that visual image, they can get it almost instantaneously. They get what you're trying to say.
Exactly. One of the metaphors, if you use advertising as an analogy, think about the difference between an ad in a full-page ad in a newspaper versus a billboard on a highway. Your PowerPoint slide should be like a billboard on a highway. If people can't get your message driving by at 70 miles an hour, then you've missed the mark, right? So there's different mediums of communication depending on who your audience is, what your purpose is, what the situation is. But that's a great analogy. Using your example, your PowerPoint slide, if people can't get it within an instant, what are they doing while you're talking? They're reading your slide. So people end up just putting their notes on the slide, the whole death by bullet point thing. If you have slides covered in bullet points and text, you're losing people, and you might as well just hand it to them and say, read this, right?
Correct. It's like a working document.
Exactly.
If you put too much information on. So let's make the leap into the next, this thing about, you've landed us in the visual imagery. So we get it. The iceberg, sketching on a napkin.
Yeah. Also use of color. If you think about that, like a traffic light, red, yellow, green, it's cultural, but it's universal, and we know what that means. So if you decided in your small town, you know what, I don't like the colors, let's make our traffic lights purple, orange, and fuchsia, something like that. Are people going to know what that means intuitively the way you do now with a red, yellow, and green traffic light? And also when I'm doing coaching with people, I'll use a technique called stop, start, continue. What's working that you want to continue? Yellow light. What are some negative behaviors that you want to stop doing? Red light. And what are some new things that maybe you want to consider start doing? Green light. So just by using each of those color representations, that's again an example of using visual imagery and visual thinking to communicate an idea.
And each one of those ideas seems to be like a strong suggestion for people. In other words, it begins to open up for them the way you want them to think.
Exactly.
So let's walk into this next section on mental models. What do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, mental models, if you picture a flow chart, if you picture a timeline, a Gantt chart, for those in the project management field, if you're familiar with the time management matrix of urgency and importance, which many people are, Stephen Covey popularized it in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, although he didn't originate it, because it's actually called the Eisenhower matrix, because President Dwight D. Eisenhower came up with the idea. But if you picture a 4-box matrix with urgency along one side and importance along the other, that's become common language. If you say on Friday I need to spend more time in quadrant 2, anyone who's familiar with this time management matrix model will know, oh, that's a day where you're focusing on things that are important but not necessarily urgent. So if you want to learn more about the time management matrix, it's in public, you can just Google it. But that's a perfect example of a mental model or a framework that creates a shorthand in a way of putting things into boxes. Because if you think about it, life's complex, right? It's complex and it's messy. So if we take the complexity of life, we could simplify it by putting things into boxes or categories so we can wrap our heads around it, process it, and then make decisions based on that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we want to put people in boxes and put labels on people, but we do that anyway. We have models like social styles or DISC or Myers-Briggs. Those are all mental models that we use to frame reality, figure things out, and act more strategically.
So excellent. Just in terms of the time management matrix, and you have it's like 2 by 2, 2 boxes on top of 2 boxes. It's easy to visualize that in your mind.
Yes.
So it's combining the visual imagery with now these boxes. I can see it, and I can see where I am and where I want to be.
Exactly. Or if someone's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you picture what shape?
Pyramid.
Right. A pyramid, right? So when I teach the 5 levels of listening at either you're either ignoring, pretending, selectively listening, attentively listening, or empathetically listening, I have that represented as a staircase, right? As you're moving up the steps, each level you're getting to a higher level of listening. So again, the visual model you use represents how you want people to think about something, how you want them to picture it. And again, process diagrams, organizational charts, mind mapping. Anyone who's done mind mapping, where you start with an idea at the center and then you branch out in all directions. Or if you take Post-its, when you put notes on Post-its and you put them all up on the wall and then you configure them by likeness, those are all ways of creating mental models and frameworks to wrap our minds around the messiness of the realities of the problems that we're trying to solve.
I especially like mind mapping. As a kid, I was always a doodler, and still am, quite frankly. But I love that, having a circle and then branching off your ideas, and then from those ideas you branch off even more. It's almost a very natural way of thinking.
Yeah, it's a way of thinking and processing information. In fact, if you think about in school, if you were a student in grade school and your teacher caught you doodling, they think you're not paying attention. But a lot of times, doodling is a kinesthetic process of basically keeping our mind active. And when I'm reading a book, if you look at your copy of your book, Leading from Your Best Self, which I love, by the way, little plug for you, Rob.
Thank you.
It's filled page by page with my notes, my answers on the exercises, circles, underlines, squares, margin notes. It's like, so if I need to go back and find something, I could actually visualize in my mind, oh yeah, I remember circling that word, or putting an asterisk next to that paragraph, or putting a square around it. Those are all visual ways that we capture information so that we recall it. I always use the words attention, comprehension, and retention, right? Visual imagery and the use of all of my visual leadership techniques help to capture people's attention, because in this world that we live in today, where everyone's distracted by their phones and by all the information coming into us, visuals capture our attention, right? That's why a picture is worth 1,000 words. It increases our comprehension, because when you see a visual representation of something, like the visual representation of data, like if you're looking at a chart or a diagram that in a newspaper like USA Today, which took the lead actually in that field on using visual representations of data, that increases our comprehension, our understanding of the information. And retention, we're going to remember pictures a lot better. There are all kinds of studies that show that if you read words, what your retention rate is 3 days later versus if you see a picture of something, and your ability to replicate that 3 days later. So it's been proven scientifically that that visuals are incredibly helpful to increase understanding and our recall.
So they grab our attention, right? Attention. They help us understand the comprehension, and we can remember it. It stays with us. It becomes sticky. It increases our retention.
And it rhymes.
Very
retention,
nice.
Comprehension, and retention. Yes.
Really nice. So let's jump into metaphors and analogies. I love metaphors and analogies, and as Aristotle said, master of metaphor is akin to genius. So anyone that thinks that that metaphors might be silly or overused, we use them all the time, don't we?
Exactly. Yeah, we use them so much more than we even realize it. And if you if once it's on your radar, and if you listen for it and pay attention to it, you'll realize that everyone, whether you're interviewing an athlete after a game, or listening to a sport or a broadcaster, or an anchor person on the news, they're using it all the time. We use a lot of sports analogies. I'm a big baseball fan, as I know you are. So using, you hit that out of the ballpark. I struck out on that presentation. There's so many that we don't even realize. So I'll touch base with you next week, or you're up next, right?
Take a swing at that one.
Yeah. So Babe Ruth said, never let the fear of striking out keep you from swinging for the fences. So it's kind of like, again, we use that all the time. But one of the keys to metaphors is for them to resonate. They need to be relatable to your audience. So like I said, I have a lot of international students in my NYU graduate class, many of them female, many of them from China, most of them in their 20s. A baseball analogy is not going to resonate with them, most likely, right?
That's right.
So using other metaphors, ones that are more universal. So for example, metaphors from nature cross all cultural lines. So if I'm talking about a tree, I may say, we need to get to the root of that problem, or let's plant the seed for an idea, or we need to branch out into new areas, or this is low-hanging fruit, right? So right there, those are 4 analogies or metaphors just from a tree.
Fantastic. I love going back to people like Einstein. Einstein used metaphors all the time. One of my favorites, life is like a bicycle. To keep your balance, you must keep moving. And so it's metaphors and analogies guide action. Yeah.
And think about, from your background in juggling, tap dancing, mime, I mean, there's a million ways you could take your background experience and communicate ideas to people based on your personal experience that you could bring to life, right?
Well, that's the other thing too, is it's great to use analogies, but it's also great to personalize them as well.
Yes.
Just from a point of view about analogies, they create, and this goes back to your mental models, they create visual mental maps to organize information in an efficient manner.
Exactly. Yeah, they make unfamiliar things familiar. They make
Yep.
complex things simple. They make unrelatable things relatable. So, but again, the flip side of that, a bad metaphor can actually do the exact opposite and alienate people, or they're more confused by your metaphor than not. So we really need to put ourselves in the heads of our audience and say, all right, what's a metaphor or analogy that will really resonate with them that they'll get? So it's either a shorthand when people get it, or does the exact opposite when they don't. So like when I'm talking about communication, there was a textbook that we used in college, one of my graduate courses. It was called Bridges, Not Walls. So when you're communicating with someone, you could be building a bridge between them, or you could be putting up a wall between you and the other person. So the idea of communication is, how do we connect with people so we can improve relationships and understand what they're saying.
The this reminds me of one of my coaching clients at MIT who was working at a technology company that did audio equipment, engineering company, and she was trying to create a cloud computing platform for all their products. And in order to organize people around it, she used the metaphor of building a house. Of it, like you have to have a foundation first. We have to build the walls up, because a lot of the engineers would come in and like want to nitpick at her, and people bought in to her analogy so strongly that when one of the engineers came in and started to nitpick, she would go, whoa, wait a minute. We haven't put in the walls yet. How can we start to pick the furniture? So it would guide them to say one thing at a time. Let's get these pieces one piece at a time.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting, as I was listening, and I'm jotting down some notes as you were talking, within your explanation, you used about five different metaphors. So if you think about cloud computing is a metaphor, right? We're not literally in a cloud. It's the concept is ideas go up there into somewhere, right? Might as well be a cloud. And so right there, nitpicking, right? We're not picking literal nits, right? And pieces, you're talking about the pieces of the puzzle, right? So again, we use metaphors to explain. A lot of times I'll see someone being interviewed. I've seen people use baseball metaphors to explain a football game, So it's just interesting. It's just part of our language. It's just the way we think and communicate. And it's creative, it's visual, and it's impactful.
Todd, this brings up something. That same person, there was another person that was a little bit competitive with her and wanted to use an analogy as well. And so he said, listen, it's like we're on an airplane together and we're flying, and we have to wait, like we have to get on it and get flying, and then we start to fix it. And people actually got like vehemently said, no, I don't want to be on a plane with you because it'll crash. It was so powerful, it created a visceral reaction in the group.
Yeah. I mean, the analogy is like, it's like, fixing this problem is like changing the tires of a race car at the Indy 500 without pulling over for a pit stop, right? So it's, again,
perfect.
A lot of times people use metaphors and it triggers in other people's metaphors, and it's like sometimes it becomes like a can you top this? Like, here's an even better analogy, here's a better metaphor. What's interesting is I sometimes do workshops with at companies where we'll say, let's come up with how would you explain to a customer what it is that you do, right? And then I'll separate people individually and have them draw on a flip chart or on a piece of paper a metaphor analogy that explains what it is that they do. And when you put them all up on the wall, what's amazing is how different they are. So here you can have 20 people in a team or department or company all working for the same company, selling the same product or service, and yet they come up with 20 different ways of representing how they would communicate that to a customer. Now, is that good or bad? So in some cases you want creativity and people to personalize it, but in others, you may be passing along mixed messages to your customer and confusing them. So one of my clients said, let's come up with one metaphor that we can all agree on and say, this is what we do and this is how we do it. And it created a common bond, a common language, and a common message for them.
Fantastic. Yeah. Anything else in terms of metaphor and analogy before we move into the next piece of this?
I mean, we could spend hours just talking about metaphors and analogies, but I think again, people underrate them, and analogies are saying this is kind of like that, and the whole purpose is getting people to, how do you explain someone's stock portfolio by saying this is kind of like your checkbook, right? So it's like, how could you bring something down from that's really big and daunting and really simplify it, capture its essence, so people can, really wrap their heads around it and understand and then make better decisions.
Again, that's exactly the point with all of this, as you said before, to become better thinkers, better communicators, better leaders. And we're about aligning people's thoughts so we can all get on the same page and move in the same direction.
Exactly.
So tell us about visual storytelling.
All right, what's interesting is I was talking about visual storytelling in one of my workshops with the CEOs, and the CEO says, I'm really terrible at storytelling. I'm like really awful at it. I'm like, I said, well, it's interesting. Why do you say that? He's like, well, let me tell you. And he went off on a 5-minute story about how bad he was on storytelling and what happened one time. And I'm like, so I kind of like hit the pause button. I'm like, what just happened here? He's like, you're right. So it's interesting is, if you think about storytelling existed long before the written word, right? Grandparents telling your parents, telling their grandchildren stories about the old country, the old days. It's like culture, organizational culture, family culture, in all its forms is passed along from generation to generation through storytelling. We teach through storytelling. What's the power of stories? They're memorable. They are human. We are wired for storytelling, right?
Well, they're totally engaging and they're relatable.
Mm-hmm.
And we can put ourselves inside of stories.
Yeah. So it helps, people who think, there are differences and there are, you tell a story, like in one of my management classes, for example, I have people talk about, think about the best or worst boss you've ever had. Tell that story. Think about the best or worst team you were ever on. Tell that story. Think about what you learned about leadership from your parents. Why do you say that? Tell me that story. So again, it creates those bridges rather than putting up walls between people. And stories break down walls in many ways because you find out the commonalities. We learn from each other. They're memorable. So
one of the things too that I find about storytelling, or not actually just the word stories, is as human beings, we're meaning-making beings, right? We create meaning out of anything. So from a culture perspective, we're always creating stories. And so I would imagine it's pretty important for a leader to be able to understand how stories get generated, how they start, and how to get ahead of a story and how to actually lead that story creation.
Exactly. Well, in this case, there are different types of stories, but the basic premise, principle of a story is the beginning, middle, and end, right? So beginning, people are fascinated by origins. People are fascinated. I know I am. Like, I love reading, like, watching the pilot of a TV series or the first episode of something or the origin of, Superman or a Spider-Man comic book, right? People have a natural inclination to want to know where it all began, right? How did things start? And if you weren't there, the only way to learn that is through a story, right? The middle part, it takes you on a journey from the beginning towards the end. And the end, people have a sense of, there's a need for closure. People want to put a bow around things. People want to say, okay, now I get it, right? So if you take a good storyteller, it takes people on a journey from beginning, middle to end, and it's very satisfying. And again, it's memorable. And again, we have our own stories, but that's one of the key components of storytelling is taking people on this journey.
So you've just triggered something in me about taking people on a journey. Before our call, you told me about being a volunteer, a Big Apple greeter.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, what's interesting is I lived in LA for 10 years and then moved back to New York City. And when I came back, I wasn't working, and I was actually I actually heard about Big Apple Greeter reading an article of, in all places, the Los Angeles Times. And when I moved back to New York and I had some free time, I volunteered for this group, which had just started up, and they've been around ever since, so for about the past 20 years. And Big Apple Greeter is a volunteer organization of New Yorkers who give visitors to New York City a tour of the city, but it's not paid for. It's not a touristy thing. what's interesting is people from outside and other parts of the country and other parts of the world, you see New York in all these movies, right? So you see the skyscrapers in Times Square, and it's very daunting and intimidating. But what they say is, people actually live here. It's like, where do you shop? Where do you go to school? So the whole idea is to like basically eliminate the fear factor and make New York a friendlier place by saying, hey, I'm going to spend 2 or 3 hours showing around this person from Australia or Rome or somewhere else, and they want to hear your stories. How did my grandparents came over from Russia in 1905. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Tell me that story. So it's a great opportunity for storytelling and story listening, because I want to hear their stories as well. So it's amazing. It's like, for me, giving tours of the city is almost like traveling. And also there's a great quote by Marcel Proust, the French novelist, that the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new lands, but in seeing with new eyes. And I love that, because when I'm giving people a tour of New York City, I'm seeing it through their eyes, and I'm noticing things and experiencing it almost for the first time because they are. And it's an amazing shared experience.
So how could a business leader take that core lesson right there and apply it to their business?
Well, a few ways. One is, as I'm talking about walking around the city, showing people around, there's the old principle from the 1950s. I don't know if Drucker or someone from that era originated it, but the whole idea of MBWA, managing by walking around, right? So as a leader, instead of sitting in your desk and basically going out the back door, I have one of my clients, the chief CEO and COO, they come in through a back door and they leave through a back door, almost like the Wizard of Oz, and no one ever sees them. Right, so that's the exact opposite. That's like managing by sneaking around instead of walking around. But get up, get out, stop by people's cubicles. You just reminded me of a story from years ago when I worked for LiquidNet. I was sitting in my little cubby hole in a side corner of the floor, and our CEO walked by, and he had just come out of like kind of a bad meeting, and I saw him like just storm by, and I just waved hi to him. He circled around, sat down in my cubicle, and he said, "I just had a really, I'm not going to use the word, really, really bad meeting. Tell me something good. Cheer me up. What's going on here?" And he spent like 15 minutes talking to me, and he left. But that was like, I don't know, 12 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. The impact of the CEO coming in and just saying, "How's your day going?" Was so impactful, and yet so many people don't do that, right? Stop, listen. And he wanted to hear my story of what was going on. So it's not just storytelling, but one of the things that leaders need to be better at is story listening, drawing out from other people their stories.
So I'm going to build on that for a moment, because our work parallels quite a bit. My background in being in theater and performing arts, I work a lot on executive presence. How someone shows up, how you experience somebody else. How you experience yourself when you're with someone else, the story they tell about you when you're gone. So this person showed up in your cubicle and was earnest, was honest, was transparent. All these, you experienced his energy, you experienced his emotional state, you experienced, and he revealed something about himself. You felt a certain way in his presence. And then when he left, there was a story that stayed, right? So there was a story. You're still telling that story 12 years later.
Yeah.
That's very powerful.
It is. Dale Carnegie had a saying, and I forget the exact words, but from a leadership perspective, the words we say to someone, we may forget 2 minutes later, but those words may linger with them for the rest of their life. And that was a great example of that. So I'm sure if I mention that to him, and I'm actually going to be seeing him next week, so I'm doing a workshop at the company next week. If I mention that to him, odds are he probably didn't remember it, because that's just one of many moments in the CEO's life, but I remember it like it was yesterday.
Very powerful leadership moment.
Yes.
And we don't realize as leaders the impact that we have on others and the stories that they create in their minds about us, about the organization. The stories are all around us.
Yeah. As you were talking about executive presence, I was talking about that with my students the other day, and I said, remember these 3 V's: visibility, voice, and value, right? Think about visibility. Are you seen, and how are you seen? Voice, are you heard, and how are you heard? And value, are you seen and heard as someone who's contributing something of value to a conversation. So as we were talking about, because these are all people in a graduate program in human resources management, HR is always, for how many years have we been talking about how does HR get a seat at the table, right? There's a great quote by Shirley Chisholm, African-American congresswoman from the 1970s, who said, if they don't invite you, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own folding chair. And I love that because it's a visual metaphor of, like, you imagine, if you're not invited, invite yourself, So once you do, then you could provide your visibility, voice, and value, and people will then say, hey, we can't have a meeting without so-and-so, get him or her in here, right? So it's like, but how do you do that at first? A big part of that is a lot of times people say, how do I become a leader? And it's like, be a leader, act like a leader. That's how you gain leadership, right? There's a book called You Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader by Mark Sandberg. And I love that title because there's so many people who have leadership titles who are not effective leaders, and yet leadership can come from anywhere, anyone, anytime, if you're willing to step up and lead.
Wonderful, Todd. We're starting to get close to the close of our conversation, and I'm really enjoying this, and I'm hoping everyone is enjoying it as well. How would you like to wrap up your thoughts for folks that are listening?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is, as I was talking about the CEOs that I met with last week in my workshop, and one of the things I had them do, instead of giving them, I had a number of management models that I use. My passion skill matrix, which is a 4-box matrix, which and the axes are, it goes from you love something to you hate it to you love it, and I'm terrible at it to I'm great at it. It's a 4-box matrix, and where you plot what you do and where you're spending your time into those boxes, and with the goal being spending as much time as possible in the things that you're good at and love to do. But by default, there are some things that we don't love and yet we need to do. So that was one model. Another was the cycle of self-development, which is a circle with 4 quadrants. And another one was the 4 reasons for non-performance performance model. And each one of those models, instead of just giving it to them, because I did have the handout, instead of giving it to them, I had them draw them. And I first started with raise your hand, show of hands, how many people here can draw? And in a group of 20 CEOs, like 1 or 2 kind of raised their hands. And then I said, well, if I asked that same question to a group of first graders, how many would raise their hand? And they laughed, and they said probably all of them. So I said, what happens, from age 6 to 36, 46, or 56, or 66, do we lose our ability to draw or our confidence? And they all said our confidence. I said, so I gave out big piece of paper and markers, grab a marker and let's draw. So I had them draw a circle, a square, and a triangle, and square, circle, triangle, and then put lines around it before they realized that they had drawn a stick figure of a person, right, or a body. And then I took those 3 shapes, the square, the circle, and the triangle, and had them draw the model. So I said, why did I do that? Here's the handout, here's the finished product. Why do they have you do that? And it's because it's when you interact, when you engage, when you draw, when you process things kinesthetically through your body. Again, it increases it got their attention because they were all actively engaged in drawing. They understood it because they had to construct these models piece by piece. And I said, I guarantee if you had to reconstruct it from memory, I bet all of you could do it within 90% accuracy. You wouldn't have been able to do any of that if I had just handed it to you. So that's one of the key takeaways is they said, I'm going to start drawing more. I'm going to napkin sketch. I'm going to have the confidence to get up at a whiteboard and say, here, let me sketch out this idea. So this is not theoretical or just for artsy people. This is literally thinking visually will help you to, again, get ideas out of your head and into other people's heads so they can say, I see what you're saying.
Brilliant. Todd, it's been a pleasure. I know that you and I can talk for probably about 2 more hours on this subject.
At least. But then we'd have to take a break and then come back for another 4 more hours.
Exactly,
yes,
right.
Definitely.
So we want to thank you again for joining us today. Todd Churches from New York City, his new book, Visual Leadership, Leveraging the Power of Visual Thinking in Leadership and in Life. You just signed a deal with Simon & Schuster, didn't you?
Yes, Post Hill Press, Simon & Schuster, literally 2 days ago. So it's now, fantastic. I've been working on this book for 2 or 3 years, and now I have a September 15th manuscript deadline. So I actually have to get it done. So, and hopefully it'll come out next year. But I was thinking 2020 is a perfect year for something on a book on visual thinking. So both in terms of hindsight and foresight, 2020 is the way we want to see the world.
Well, we hope that we look forward to your book and reading it. Hopefully, I'll have my reading glasses on, of course, but it'll
there'll be plenty of visuals in it, so even if you don't have to worry about the fine print.
So thanks, Todd. And if anyone again would like to learn more about the Leadership Forum, www.leadershipforum@silverbay.com. We invite anyone who would like to come to the program, the conference that happens the second week in July in beautiful upstate New York, Silver Bay on Lake George. Go to the website, find out about it, find out about us. I think you'll have a great time. Todd, thank you very much for your time today.
Rob, it's been my pleasure. I always enjoy talking to you.
And we look forward to the next podcast when it comes around. Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.